Welcome, educators and champions of physical and health education. I'm Josh Reed, and I'm excited to be starting on this journey with you. Today, we're joined by Jessy Wollen. Jessy is the founder of Shift Education and a Certified Sexual Health Educator with 13 years of experience exclusively in the area of sexual health education. In addition to working with school districts throughout Metro Vancouver, Shift Education partners with a variety of youth-centered organizations. Jessy is currently facilitating her student-centered experiential curriculum and training for educators in districts throughout the lower mainland of British Columbia. Thanks for being with us today, Jessy, and welcome. As we begin, we pause to recognize that we're on Turtle Island. Let this acknowledgement be a moment for reflection on the importance of reconciliation, respect, and uplifting the voices of the original inhabitants of this land. I think it's a great place to start with maybe just telling us about Shift Education, how it came about, your journey, what came before, and how things are right now.
Thanks, Josh. I am the founder of Shift Education, and it came about when I was in high school here in BC on the west coast of British Columbia and Canada. I didn't have any health education. I had one class in grade 5, I remember, where we learned about periods and menstruation, and then it kind of disappeared into the night. There was nothing else. Of course, we were always, in friendships and in different kinds of groupings in school and learning experientially, but there was no direct instruction around healthy relationships. There was no direct instruction around sexually transmitted infections. I also, at the same time, was seeing a lot of really unhealthy behaviors happening. Certainly among my girlfriends, a lot of my friends, we would be spending time on the weekends, and a lot of the older guys in the community in the small town I lived in, much older, 22, 23, hanging out with 15 and 16-year-old teenager girls. I knew that this was wrong. I knew it was weird. I didn't like them. A couple of my friends did like, being around them, but they didn't treat them very respectfully. So that was a really formative moment, especially because it was juxtaposed with, I was fortunate enough to go to a camp as a kid, and I worked as a counselor from age 15 to 20. And that was a YMCA camp. And so what I witnessed there and was a part of were a lot of really healthy relationships, healthy friendships for the first time for me with the opposite sex, which was new for me. I had been like a volleyball player. I'd been really involved in hanging out with girls a lot, but I didn't really have a lot of male friends. And so at camp, I had a lot of male friends that weren't being creepy. And I don't have a brother, so I didn't really know what that was like. It was really new to me. And it was so wonderful to enjoy friendship with the opposite sex. It sounds funny today because I think that we've actually come a long way. And there's a lot of friendships between kids. We don't even really gender kids in the same way that we did. But I thought this is crazy that relationships are so central to our lives. Being healthy in our bodies is so central to our lives, but yet if we accidentally get pregnant or if we don't have knowledge about our bodies, we need to have this information. This is a right that turns out it is our right to actually have comprehensive knowledge about our bodies, about sexuality, about health. And so I really went into the space with the thought of, I didn't have this as a kid. I know my friends didn't have this as a kid. And we really need this to be healthy adults and to be healthy adults in healthy relationships. And so I was working actually at a private school at the time, and I was pregnant with my first child. And I decided, you know what? I really want to be involved in raising my child. I was going to go on mat leave anyway. I was on a contract. So I thought, okay, let's do this. And I couldn't go back to my regular job because I was on contract. And I thought, okay, let's do this. And I did a self-employment program at BCIT, which is a school here in British Columbia. It's a great technical school. And they offered a business program. And I took that and I just jumped and I went for it. I started my own company with a little tiny baby.
And now, after all this time, how have you seen Shift evolve and kind of become what it is today?
Yeah, it really has evolved. I actually spent quite a bit of time and still do work closely with, and I'm very passionate about supporting families with kids that have developmental delays or have neurodiversity. So I do really love and support that community. That was one of my starting points, was supporting folks with developmental delays and boundaries and setting. and also alongside working with typical kids. So now the company has expanded. I've done some hiring, and we have essentially, we teach in schools, we teach health education, we teach a lot of online tech savvy skills. So how to be making good choices online, but not just that, but how to actually really take care of your attention span, and how do you actually kind of put those boundaries on as a family to prevent phones from interrupting our relationships. And I do a lot of teacher training. That's a big part of my year. That's the first part that I book up every year in September. So I'd be booking that for next year now, and going in and teaching and training teachers. And then also I've developed some, as a teacher, fellow teacher, you know that once you have set up a good lesson that goes well, 10 years in, you know, okay, this is a good lesson. So I created an educational kit, as you mentioned earlier, and that's really taking off now. So a lot of people around the Lower Mainland, even as far as New Brunswick, are purchasing more kits. So this is essentially an educational kit with set stations for students to do student-centered learning. And the teacher calls rotation. So rather than the PE teacher being completely responsible for every single aspect of the comprehensive sexual health curriculum, whatever that looks like across BC, they're able to use the circuit as a tool to meet those learning outcomes. Without having to do a stand, direct, and deliver, which so many PE teachers are nervous about because, of course, they might not have gone to school to teach sexual health education. In fact, they almost never have. And so they want the education, they want it in their schools, they want it for their students, but they don't necessarily have or want to deliver the content of comprehensive sexual health. It can be tricky. So that's where the kit comes in. So those are the three areas that I teach in. And I've even gone up north into a few Indigenous communities that I've partnered with that I'm returning to again this year, teaching health education in the schools and supporting the community that way. So it's been really amazing. I feel so grateful to be where I am now.
Yeah, well, it sounds like many years of hard work and a lot of dedication. Like you said, it all started with Child in Arms, and through PhD Canada, I had the exposure to see you share your resource with other educators and seeing their eyes light up at the circuit and the possibilities that are within that. So happy to talk about it today. I think you've mentioned it a couple times, and just for our listeners, really want to differentiate between when we talk about health education, but more specifically that sexual health education. When we talk about it throughout today's episode, if you could just outline the things that we're kind of talking about, the topics that are covered within a school setting.
I really have to say that I'm most familiar with the BC curriculum, but when we talk about comprehensive sexual health, it is a age appropriate, age specific education from kindergarten all the way to grade 10 here in BC. And so what that looks like, a lot of parents go, yikes, what does that mean? Kindergartens? You're not teaching sex to kindergartens. No, you're not. Kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, learn about abuse prevention. So the whole idea is that young people will learn the names of their body parts. We'll have conversations about types of touch, which include, of course, conversations about all the kids that I teach love to talk about how they love snuggling with their families. And we talk about what kind of touch do you like to have with your friends? What kind of connection do you have with your friends? Kids will say the most profound things like, I love to hold my friend's hand and run across the field. That's your, like, those are some of my favorites are the primaries. So that's like your grade 1, 2 class. They're so sweet. So this abuse prevention is about how do we give language to the types of physical interactions we have with our family, that we have with our friends, and how do we identify what is unsafe touch? When all kids can identify unsafe touch, that's part of the puzzle. But of course, the other part of the puzzle is a big piece that, in my opinion, is missing is the education of parents and the education of teachers, the education of professionals. Coaches now are getting more of that. Priests, lots of different areas where we've seen some very unsafe behaviors go out over years and years. And we know that abuse, sexual abuse in particular, is so damaging. One child can have an unsafe experience and it can change the trajectory of their life. It can be a trauma that is with them for a very long time. Another person can have the same experience and not necessarily experience such deep trauma. So we want all kids to be free from unsafe touch. And they need to know what that is, but we also need to give parents skills to talk about that. So then we get to grade 4, 5. So grade 3, 4, I also start talking about online safety. And in the curriculum, you'll see there's quite a bit about avoiding hazardous materials, experiences, moments. And so that's where we talk about, in elementary, you might remember talking about like, look both ways before you cross the street. We don't want to scare them. Sometimes I feel like my job is be careful. But actually, we want to empower kids to follow rules. In kindergarten, grade 1, 2, and 3, they're so great at following rules. Grade 4 and 5, and when kids start to get online, we want to talk about making good choices online. How would you know? And I talk to kids actually about how do you know if you're talking to an adult online? How do you know if you're playing a video game like Roadblock? So they'll tell me, I know because they're typing faster. I know because of the language they use. I know. And so kids are really clever. They have lots to say about good choices they already are making. And that's what I like to do, is pull out their wisdom. And I've learned a ton from them. So that's a bit about the online safety piece and making good choices online, and even now screen time, limiting that, connecting with your families. Kids have a lot to say about their parents being on their phones, myself included, and the importance of those relationships not being interrupted. The funniest quote from the other day was, what's a strategy you use to get your parents' attention when they're on their phone? And he said, I nibble on my dad's sweatshirt. Like a goat. I thought that was so funny. And also so creative, right? That's like a grade 2, 3 class. So kids are using all sorts of strategies to get attention from their families, but it's wanted, loving attention is what they want, right? And then we get into grade 4, 5. That's puberty. I would say across the board, it's probably puberty. I imagine in Ontario, it's similar. And those are just really exciting conversations about what you look forward to about growing up. We talk about those physical changes. I use a lot of that gender neutral language, talking about all bodies, because believe it or not, most of the changes happen to all bodies. And we talk specifically about biological female bodies and menstruation, and biological male bodies, nocturnal emission. Then we get into grade 6, 7, where we're adding in more about social emotional changes. Social emotional changes, of course, friendship. A classic example is we talk about if there's a real lack of sleep, how's that going to impact your body? You feel tired. How's that going to impact your emotions? You feel grumpy. How's that going to impact your friendship? They might think you're being mean or you're being rude. So the importance of having a good night's sleep, right, is a huge foundation that we're focusing on. And then actually, sexually transmitted infections comes up in grade 7. So I will talk about HPV and the vaccine, and talk about how that is a cancer prevention tool. And that's something that's being really, advertised right now in BC. Is I can tell they're working hard on making sure that everyone's getting their HPV shot, which is great, cancer prevention. However, my hope is that we get more teachers learning how to teach comprehensive health education, because I am a presenter. I come in, I am a teacher, but I only have 3 classes per grade. So if you were an experienced teacher listening to this, you'd go, wow, but she's not getting to this. She's not getting to that. So this is my years of experience of picking out the pieces that I think are the most essential that I can get across in 3 lessons. If you're a teacher in the class, there's a lot more you can do. And that's why I always advocate for teachers to learn. To summarize, grade 8, grade 9, that's when we get a lot more online safety. We get a lot more making healthy sexual decisions, STIs, pregnancy prevention, and then grade 10, similar material, healthy relationships, how to identify unhealthy relationships, and on it goes. So it's a pretty deep and rich curriculum, lots of great things in there, but it is scaffolded over time, always age appropriate as we go along.
As you go through that, from doing my teacher education in Nova Scotia and being in Ontario, I think it's pretty consistent across the country, the topics that are being covered. I think you bring up a really telling point around that teacher education and what is provided for teachers to be able to teach not only sexual health education, but health education as a whole in a well-rounded, holistic way for students. I'd love to get your opinion on where you feel teacher education is at the pre-service level, but then even while teachers are in their role, stereotypically it's the phys ed teacher that has to take on the role as the health education teacher. What does that look like within the system, and what's your experience going into schools and talking to the professionals that are there with the students, and what are they kind of really asking for?
I think part of the reason that they're really happy about the circuit and me introducing the circuit, which by the way is also not completely hitting all the curricular outcomes. There's 10 stations, but what they like about it, it's game based. It's hard to be a PE teacher and take away the physicality and movement. Kids love movement, kids need movement. And so I think the move of health education into the PE curriculum was definitely a tricky one. And I think that we're getting there. We've gone through a lot of growing pains, but I do think that PE teachers are more and more open to it now than they ever have. We also see a lot of young people coming up. I know the training programs are only a year long. I actually think that all PE teachers that are being trained, it would be mandatory for them to take some kind of health education training or ongoing course so they feel a sense of confidence coming in. And also not just confidence, but excitement. What I love about teaching the kindies, grade 1s, 2s, and 3s is they're excited about their bodies. That's a time when we feel good in our bodies. That's a time where we're like, I am strong. That's the time where we're like, my body does jiggle when I shake it. It's super positive the way we think about ourselves. And I think that if we can lead with that same type of example in preparing and supporting young upcoming teachers to thrive in the health education space and really have it be a strength-based opportunity. Hey, we want you to share this. This is exciting. We are thrilled that you're able to do this. And how can we support you to look at the scope and sequence at the school? How can we support you to, in your next Pro D, what can we do to get you feeling like there's a cross district scope and sequence in the same way there is for science, in the same way there is for math? What are you doing in the elementary schools in the district? So we know we're doing some review and crossover, but it's a scaffolded plan that we've all board with. I think that it's possible. I actually think we're on our way. And what that takes is looking at the university level, what information are people getting? At the hiring level, what kind of orientation? If we know that we're hiring a PE teacher, what kind of pre-service? Like, let's get them doing a consent module. Let's get them looking at the curricular material and paying them even for, a week before they start teaching. So on salary, it's like, okay, we're grouping into your salary this pre-service piece so that you feel prepared. And then this is one of the requirements. It's a really important education curriculum. This is what it looks like for supporting parents so that it's not in a container, right? There's a huge community. And what's the crossover from the health ministry and the education ministry? When, that's what's happened over here in BC is that the health authorities going, hang on a second, we're seeing a bunch of syphilis happening in the younger population. What's going on? And then you look downstream and you're like, oh, well, all the people coming from downstream haven't been doing condom demos. They haven't been learning about sexually transmitted infections. And what information are they looking at online that is complete nonsense? It's not actually real, factual, science-based evidence. And so that's something that BC is doing is going, okay, let's get our public health nurses into the schools and support these PE teachers. What does that look like? We don't want to have the nurses teaching the class, but how do we support PE teachers to feel like they've got it, to really hold them up and give them the opportunity? Because we have some hugely skillful PE teachers. They can run a class like nobody's business, right? They've been teaching for 20 years. The content's a little bit scary, but if a younger teacher can come in and handle the content and the older, more experienced teacher can hold the space for it, it's amazing what's possible because the kids are open to it. They want to know. They're online. You're younger than me. I don't need to tell you.
Yes, absolutely. This brings up an interesting point because I was having a conversation with a colleague not too long ago ahead of this conversation. They're a PE teacher themselves and teach health education. And I turned to them and I said, do you feel qualified to teach health education? And they replied kind of ummed and ahed about it for a little bit. No, not really, but I feel really confident in doing it. I've been doing it for years. But if I look at the amount of training I've had in phys ed, I've had none in health education, but I teach it every year and I'm confident in the way I teach it and get what I need to get across. But my professional training is actually very little. And I feel, like I say, we have so many amazing health educators across the country. We're almost doing them a disservice by saying, you can go and do it over there and we'll give you 3-4 lessons across a semester. It just really interests me around, the amount of time we allocate to it, how much energy and resources we're willing to put towards it as a whole school environment, not just that one individual, but then how much attention it gets in the media, in the news, community, how things are taught, who's teaching it. There's so many avenues. It kind of is a a really murky water. But when you take a step back and you are actually in it with the educators, people are trying really, really hard to do it the right way. So it is tough when you see everything on the media and the news, even just having conversations with other parents that don't see it from the day to day. It can become very disheartening because you see the people are trying to put things in place for the students. So
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, I agree. I think, it's really tricky too, because I think that post COVID, which a lot of people would say post COVID isn't a real thing because COVID is still spreading around. But after this moment of social isolation that we've all experienced, we know that relationships are so essential. And I think that there's a huge portion of the generations that have not received the education that they deserved. And they had to really figure it out on their own. And we have a lot of folks walking around with kind of unsettled trauma and unhealed, right? And all of us probably could attest to that in some way. So it's a political space, it's a political landscape. And I mean, one thing that for sure is, I think, a lucky part for me is that I run my own business. And so I have that is also a privilege, right? Like, I can go into a school, I can teach at that school, and then if something goes not well, the parent can call me up and they can talk to me. I will answer my phone. I'll have a conversation with them, but it's not on the district. They can just choose not to hire me the next year. And that's something that I think that arm's length is really feels safer for schools sometimes. But I am seeing the model now with a lot of health educators are being hired within the district to not teach all of content themselves because they just can't. You can't get to that. It's too many kids. But what they're doing instead is they are training and supporting teachers like your teacher as an in-district support because it's taking up so much time. When we log, I've never done these mathematics, but I wish I had the skill to put this together in terms of a stat or data, because I teach probably about 7,000 kids a year. So when I go to each of those schools, I know I often work with the principals in high schools. I work usually with the vice principal in charge. If I could tally the amount of hours spent, minutes even spent on sexual misconduct. So we'll talk about everything from some weird texting, dick pics sent back and forth, this and that, kids talking to each other in a sassy, disrespectful way that's sexualized, body comments, body shaming, cyberbullying, which also is in the curriculum, unsafe language in the school that's being used, that's trickling in from pornography, to push back on sexual orientation and gender identity and how much time that takes to support parents to understand it's two different curriculums, and that actually there's a huge process in place that if somebody is going to transition, they have lots of medical care and they see many doctors, and they have part of that transition conversation is about some girls not feeling safe at school and identifying as male or kind of hiding their bodies more because they don't want to hear porn language in the hallways. Like, there's so much time spent on putting out fires, not even this is a band-aid scenario, putting out fires, not actually from the inside out, reframing and looking at, wow, we're humans. We want to connect. The way that we're even here is because our parents, whether we want to think about it or not, got together and created us. And the fact that we're even alive, we won the lottery. Like I tell grade 2s and 3s when we talk about the sperm and the egg, in one ejaculation, there's even some evidence of 1 billion sperm. So imagine, let's say 250 to 500 million sperm and one egg, you won. We all won. Like, we should be celebrating that we even are here. We weren't just like some dead cell 44 years ago that never turned into anything, right? So we don't want to talk about that for some reason. And I think we don't want to talk about that because of secrecy. It's easier to not talk about it because we haven't been modeled how to talk about it. It's easier to ignore it and pretend it's not happening. And trauma. We've been hurt. People have been hurt. And so I'm all for talking about it. I think my mom was a nurse, and I'm all for talking about where people are at. We don't have to dive into super deep stuff off the hop, right? So like your friend that says, I bet you he is experienced. I bet you he is awesome at teaching that simply because he's comfortable in the space. That's a big part of it. You can learn the science. You can learn how to do a condom demo and practice it several times with like not waving the wooden penis around, but actually be keeping it really still and being really intentional and really professional. You can practice that, right? You can practice learning about cycles of violence and how do we we avoid that? We can talk about making promises to each other that we're not going to hurt or harm each other when alcohol is involved. And that's when a sexual misconduct or sexual assault usually occurs, is often paired with alcohol. We can have all those conversations. We can learn how to have those conversations. But actually, experienced teachers have skill in holding space for those conversations more, I would say, than an unexperienced teacher. But an unexperienced teacher might come in with the content and the training. So you could see how there would be a beautiful pairing. At each school, we could have almost champions and bring in a few TOCs or TTOCs like to cover so that they can practice. Okay, we're going to practice, right? And also to say to the students, we're going to make mistakes. But you know what's important? That we're really doing our best to get this education out, this content out, because you deserve it, because it's your right to be able to have healthy relationships. So I think that, to go back to your friend, sometimes we just need to start and then also look to who our mentors are and what does that look like in terms of mentoring, training at schools. And that's definitely something I've been a part of, and I see it working. I go into a school and I'll teach a part. I'll have the teachers come in. I'll do a demo day where they're seeing like, okay, and they leave. They're like, oh my gosh, I think I can do this. And then they practice it 2, 3, 4 times. And you know what? On the 5th class, they're way better than they were the first. And then one last thing I would say to that, another piece that's really reminded me and brought a lot of teachers on board is if you go on TikTok and start looking at like sexually transmitted infections or birth control, there are people on TikTok for sure that are doctors that you can look up and follow up to see that they are doctors. Go to their website and do that background research. There are a lot of people on TikTok that kids are looking at, that they're learning about, oh, I can make my own homemade contraceptive. Oh, I know, I can take my own IUD out. So here we have this situation where kids are turning to, naturally, they're looking for the resources. They're going online. They're finding unhealthy and often unsafe resources that they have no other safe adults in their life telling them that that's not actually safe, or that's not what you would do. You would go to a clinic. You need to talk to a health practitioner. And so we do have young people turning to the internet and turning to TikTok in particular for health resources that are not viable or safe health resources. And when PE teachers saw that recently, they were like, oh, I can do a better job than that. Which made me so happy, because it's like, of course you can. So as much as it's scary, kids are looking at things that are way scarier.
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of an endless stream of nonsense out there. And that's the scary part. I think especially when we do really consider that political landscape of, if it's not happening in schools, with caring educators, where are the kids turning to learn this? And we can all say it's happening at home, but it is scary and definitely highlights the need for comprehensive health education, especially sexual health education in schools. One thing I would really like to dive in, you kind of mentioned it as you were talking before, but more so around how do we make the health education classroom, even when we're talking and teaching around sexual health education, when we have, in the context of Canada, a very multicultural, diverse set of students in front of us that can be from where they come from in terms of where they are born, but also in how they view themselves and see themselves, an individual from the 2SL LGBTQ plus community. How, in your own experience, have you dealt with, handled, addressed, approached those environments?
That's a great question. I was and still do teach in many, many deeply multicultural schools. Like one school I taught at last year had 70 languages that they spoke in the school. So in a PE class, you bring all the kids in and you have every single kind of background culture that you can imagine. Very, very conservative folks religiously and spiritually. And then you have some kids that are a lot more liberal, everybody in the same room. My feeling is that this generation of kids, there's a lot of respect to individual rights, and there's a lot of practice has been done in the schools, certainly in BC, and I think this is across the board, on self-regulation. So a lot of kids in elementary have been doing a lot of like how to stay calm and deep breathing and, getting back into calm so that you can be in a learning space, and noticing when you need your body's moving to get up and do a little body break and come on back. So that kind of self-regulation skill, and then that level of respect for individuality, but also respect for the community, I find can create such a beautiful learning environment. And I really like to lean on values. Every kid comes into the classroom with values, and there's a lot of space to talk about values that are inclusive of everybody. You can have strong values around social justice, and I can respect that. I can have strong values around traditional thinking and respect that. An example of that is, so when I'm working up in Indigenous communities, I have a values game in the circuit, which is a card game where kids will play in a group of 4. But I've also done this in a big classroom because that's where I first started practicing it. And all of the things that went into the values card game, or things you can imagine: teamwork, honesty, trustworthiness, adventurousness, joyful, funny, faithful, reliable, right? So all these different kind of adjectives are in the value station. And when I'm here teaching in a typical school, kids won't pick traditional thinking. Traditional thinking almost has kind of a negative connotation, like, oh, they're probably really like strict, and they don't, they're like old school. Whereas when I go up into the communities I'm teaching in, traditional thinking means kids will often pick traditional thinking because to them it means following their Indigenous families' values, like catching fish. So we talked about what are traditional values. So when kids get a chance to be who they are in a group of peers, but also their peers are able. So this is especially for grade 10s because they're mature enough to have these conversations and they're really ready to talk about how they feel. They're also developed enough usually where they really carry a lot of their family values, but they've also had some time to reflect on their own values and see who they are outside of their family. Like that's a huge part of being an adolescent. And so it's so beautiful to hear them talk about it. And then as a group, we actually talk about what are some of the shared values that came up. So one of the exercises I'll do where the kids, if it's a whole class, where the kids will get up and vote on a whiteboard, we reflect this poster with all the values. They have to pick their 3 top values they look for in a friendship. And then they put a little dot beside it, they vote. And then we all sit back and we look, what are some of the patterns of shared values in the class? And we might have a range of belief systems in the class, but a lot of people believe in trustworthiness. That was the number 1 for grade 10s, trust. Honesty, close second. Support, open-mindedness, right? Like, so it's really amazing what you get out of classes like that is we're actually so much more the same than we are different. And I think kids really need to hear that now because we live in a world that's so divisive at times if you're just tuned into tech. But the reality is actually, I think the kids are okay. I think the kids are making some really great choices. The kids are more empathetic than they've ever been. We're getting closer to kids being really inclusive. For sure, we see higher anxiety and higher depression, but we also introduced a whole new language to our kids so they're able to express how they're feeling. I personally think that we're ready to now talk also about the positive sides of anxiety. Like that's why we've survived as a human race because we didn't just keep running towards the saber-toothed tiger and like try to pet it. We knew that we needed to be afraid of it. But I think that the kids, a lot of ways, we've actually have grown a lot since certainly my generation where it was very individualistic. We weren't as empathetic of each other. That leadership piece wasn't as strong. So it's a lot though. It definitely is a lot. But I do think that kids and young adults are so eager to have their voice heard and supported. So that's also another space for them to come in and do, what does that look like for bringing in some student leadership in the class in a very framed up, very contained kind of structure so that they can feel safe, but also they can practice and flex some of their, like they could run a values class. It's not about STIs. It's not about a condom demo. We're not putting them into the trickiest things, but we're giving them skills to talk about relationships, talk about what's important and model to the younger ones. Oh, wow. That guy's like one of the coolest, hottest guys in the school. And he really values trust. Like that's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think even as you're saying that, it takes you back to the start of our conversation where you spoke about time and how you have to create the space where people can share those values. And you take that class or however long it might take you to have folks open up and feel like they can share their true opinion or their true self. Whereas that values lesson might not be on the curriculum as such in grade 10, but is the foundation to actually having a successful health education class throughout the year. When we met in person, Jessy, I can remember sitting with you and discussing kind of this podcast and how it would go. And it was the first time I met you and you began speaking about porn, and it blew me away of just the confidence and aura around discussing it. For someone starting out in their career, speaking about myself and just how my view on porn is happens behind closed doors. You never discuss it and share those things. I would love to open the door on the conversation around pornography as like in of itself, but then also what we see coming out of an unlimited access to pornography, in that we have gender-based violence, sexual assaults in youth and young adult on the rise, and navigating these types of topics. So I kind of pornography as a whole, and then how you see that in a health education, sexual health education
That's
context.
a really great question. I absolutely remember that conversation too. I think that one of the biggest takeaways is don't tell personal stories. I think that's like, before we get into the conversation about pornography, I think it's so important to know that it is a private matter, right? It is something that a lot of people look at pornography. Let's get real. When you look at Pornhub stats every year, you can get an idea of how many people don't want to talk about it, but are absolutely doing it. And not from a shame-based place, but just like, okay, humans are very curious people. They have a sexual drive, and this is something that's of interest that they can access in the privacy of their own home. And so it is an adult-based material, right? And one of the things that's tricky is, certainly I don't get a lot of opportunities to talk with teenagers about pornography because I only teach 3 classes. And if I only teach 3 classes, I wouldn't talk about pornography off the hop without noticing the kids squirming in their seats. I want them to feel that they know me a little bit more before I just start talking about this topic that's very, very deeply private. Also, because I'm very boundaried and private myself, I want the kids to feel as though we're talking about a subject and externalizing the subject that a lot of us know about. I also need to respect that fact that some of the kids in the room have purposely chosen not to look at a lot of pornography. And there's a range, right? There's this giant spectrum of experience of like looking at it, being interested in it, having a regular activity of looking at it and having that practice. But I like to talk about, what do we know, right? What do we already know about pornography? And also, it's a really political topic. There's a lot of research about pornography, and you'll see that the money that's gone into research pornography is very polarized. Some of the research that goes into pornography talks about how it's really, really bad for you and it causes arousal to physical violence. And then other people will talk about how it's not bad for you and these are the pluses, these are the minuses. I'm interested in kids having knowledge about, what is it? What do we know about it? What does the science tell us, that non-biased science as we can find? I do like to talk about how urologists see an increase in erectile dysfunction, right? It's actually funny because I have young people in my life that are in their 20s that I told about that probably 10 years ago. And they've told me that that was actually one of the biggest deterrents that they had heard, because they really wanted their body to function well. So they always kind of thought of looking at pornography and having a personal practice of self-pleasure to pornography in a private space as something that was private, but also kept in moderation. And so we know that there are more young people in their 20s that are visiting urologists with the inability to get an erection. And so that's a concern for sure. That makes me think, okay, what is a healthy approach to, if we are looking at pornography? How can we keep it in check? What are your personal values around this? Some young people will say that they cannot masturbate unless they're looking at pornography, which, well, that's not the case, because there used to be erotica, there used to be pinups, and all of this has been a part of our culture. The difference is now we have unlimited access. We also have unlimited access, several windows open. There's video, there's still images. So I think that putting anything into our brains, we have to be conscious of, is that what we want going into our brains? Do I feel good, myself as a valued person in my life, where my friends know me and my family know me, and then my online life? Do I feel like there's a marriage between those two people, or do I feel shame around what I'm doing in my private time? Is there a way for me to not feel shame in my private time? A lot of people talk about OnlyFans, and I think, people that are running their own accounts don't have a pimp. They don't have someone sexually exploiting them. That's naive. Of course, there are some people that have sexual exploitation, but there are a lot of people that are running their own channels, running their own small business. They have their set of people. That's not something that I want to promote, but that's a move forward. Women have been exploited for thousands of years by other people. And here we have people that are password protected. They've got special names that are totally different and anonymous. They're doing their own work in the privacy of their own homes and making a really good income doing it. There's so much shame that's put into sexuality. And at the end of the day, it's okay to have pleasure. In fact, it's a wonderful part. We have pleasure in all other aspects of our lives that we don't feel bad about. You don't get into a bath and go, God, I'm a bad person. You don't visit with your friend at the beach and watch a sunset and go, oh, we're just so bad that we're watching the sunset. But at the end of the day, we have these pleasure centers in our body and it's okay for us to use them. In fact, it's wonderful. The research tells us that when young people are able to experience pleasure in their bodies and know how their own bodies feel good, they're more likely to avoid an unhealthy relationship. So we know that kids that have been touching their body in a way that feels good, they will more likely avoid an abusive or harmful relationship because they know what feels good and they know what isn't safe or isn't good. That's a researched piece of evidence, right? So this is what I think we need to lean on. When it comes to the conversation about pornography, I think we also need to talk about how do we make choices around this? When we see violence on the screen, something unsafe happening to usually a man to a woman, and she doesn't seem to be having real experience of pleasure in that moment, but actually is being harmed, grimacing, having her hair pulled, something that is in real life would be considered assault or sexual assault. I don't have a lot of evidence around that. I'm not sure if there is very much. I'm sure if I got a PhD, I would be able to speak way better about this, but something feels wrong about building arousal from a young age to physically painful sexual acts. And so I worry about that. I worry about young people, all of the sensations and wiring that's happening when they talk about what fires together, wires together. My concern is that if kids are looking at pornography and something bad is happening, usually from a man to a woman, and they're putting that in their brains over and over and over again and attached with physical touch, sight, and sound, I worry, is that a kind of arousal that they have as an expectation in real life? Is that something that they want to try out in real life? That's sexual assault in real life, right? That's physical assault in real life. And so I feel like kids want to talk about that. Like when I say kids, I mean students. I mean like grade 10s, I think would be a really good place. Grade 8 and grade 7, I think, is the time I do like a PSA. I talk about a public service announcement. I encourage kids to delay looking at adult-based material to them about some of the basics. And actually, I go to amaze.org, is an online website for out of the States, but it's made by doctors and nurses and health practitioners, and then animators are hired to make these cute little videos. And so there's a couple on pornography in there, and it talks about how a lot of the time the bodies are modified. So what are the facts that we know? That these are actors, that this is a fantasy. This was created to conjure up a fantasy-based idea. The actors often are meeting each other for the first time that day. We don't see them using condoms in those images because it's a fantasy. It's a made-up scenario. And then, I do lean hard on talking about how a lot of the time intimacy is more satisfying or more, is certainly more safe when you have some kind of set relationship with that person, that there's a foundation of trust. And that's what the kids tell me, right? They say hooking up doesn't really feel actually that great. It can feel a bit empty. Sometimes it's fun, but most of the time they actually find that there's more value in having your values match the values of the person that you want to be intimate with, developing that trust, feeling safe when you're alone with that person before you would be intimate with them. So when we talk about pornography and putting it in the corner as a fantasy, if we want to have a real relationship with somebody in real life, it's going to look different. And also, what does your partner need to know about the act of looking at pornography? What images do you feel good looking at or not looking at? Do you want to do that? When I talk to young people in grade 7 or 8, I will say, I really encourage you to hold off as long as you can until like at least 16, and if not 18, but 16 would be really great for your beautiful brains. And then I tell the parents, lock it down. Let's make it really, really challenging for kids to look at pornography because we want them to delay. I think it's in our best interest for our adult sexual self to delay the exposure to adult imagery. And that's kind of how I teach it. And I do worry about sexual assaults. I don't want to think that people are looking at pornography and becoming sexual assaulters because of it. I don't have any way of proving that one way or the other, but I do worry as a mother of sons, of my beautiful sons and their imagination and how their imagination is being that the imagination and novelty of the porn industry that is driven by, a multi-trillion-dollar industry, sparking the attention of my son's imagination by flashing boobs or by flashing an image that's really exciting, that's totally makes sense that they would be excited by that and interested by that, but using that in a manipulative way to draw them into adult-based imagery that I don't actually think is respectful or reflective of their values, or that is a fantasy. It's a fantasy. It's an imaginary thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind throughout this whole conversation and kind of at the premise of the, how I asked the question was really around that consent. And I think that's where there is a mismatch there between pornography and like you say, that fantasy and real life, and the
Mm-hmm.
lack of consent. How do we go about asking for consent? What does that look like? What does that sound like? And then you throw alcohol and drugs and all the rest of it into the mix. And one of the biggest things I see is around that
Mm-hmm.
consent conversation. But yeah, definitely a topic that we will have to revisit.
Definitely. And I mean, even like I'd have to say that even within the realm of pornography, I'll often talk to kids and my kids' friends who are about 12. They'll say to me, I haven't seen pornography yet, which I think is great because they're 12 and a lot of kids will see it before then. But they'll say, but I did see a dead body. And so there's other stuff too. Like, what are our values in terms of consent? What is our consent to see an image that we don't want to see? Right. And then we see, these hockey players getting into a situation of sexual assault with a person is getting harmed. And I guarantee you, if you sat down with those kids that are kids, the remorse they would feel. And this woman now who deals with this, who's going to be dragged through the mud for years and years to come, because she was the one that destroyed their careers that they worked so hard for. So how do we prevent this, right? How do we actually prevent this and get kids thinking about, because there's nothing wrong with pleasure. And so our kids really need us to be leaders in their lives right now in terms of limiting access, because it is adult content, and being able to have open conversations. And so having those conversations at school, really bolstering up educators and finding those champions in our school that feel comfortable. Even better if they have a science background, biologists, scientists are awesome at talking about bodies because they've trained in it. Finding educators that are younger and feel a little bit more comfortable in the space, and then senior educators that are able to hold space and kind of create a respectful environment. Pairing up, how do we skillfully involve parents and get parents on board in terms of their support and have them know what we're talking about, what we're teaching about, clarifying what the curriculum is so that they don't feel afraid. They go, wow, thank you for having those conversations, and I'm going to pick it up at home. We're going to watch Riverdale together with my teenager and talk about these makeout scenes with adult looking characters that are actually in their late 20s making out and doing different things. And we're going to talk about, does that seem like a healthy relationship? What do you think? Would you want to have a partner that was like this? And then talking to our kids about, hey, if you are struggling because you're looking at pornography more than you want to, if you're having invasive thoughts where you're seeing something, you've seen something that keeps showing up in your head, you can't stop thinking about it. Some kids struggle with pornography fixation, right? In the same way that somebody might struggle with, they were very anxious, they started vaping, and now they're vaping all the time, and they've built it into their anxiety loops that they have in the day, and now the nicotine is an addictive substance. Our job as adults, in my opinion, is to help give kids information that's based in science that we know is true and support them in making healthy decisions in their lives. And I know PE teachers can do this with training. I think the conversation about pornography is very nuanced and something that takes time to finesse. I still feel like a fish out of water sometimes. But I do think that in time, if we're building a solid scaffolded foundation of age appropriate health education all the way through, we get to a point where we can talk about those public service announcements. And then by the time we get to grade 9 and 10, they have more skill to talk about complicated and complex issues, and they want to. As a finisher, I sat down with 3 young women who are quite frustrated. They're not learning about comprehensive sexual health in school. They're not getting the information they need. And the things they brought up that they want to talk about are so many of the things they've talked about today. They want to talk about healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. They want to talk about online dating and how do you, as an adult, how do you online date? They want to talk about different forms of intimacy and how do you talk about the gray zone? How do you talk about what you like and what you don't like? What language can you use? When you get in conflict with someone you really care about, how do you separate your feelings from your desire? How do we practice meeting in person to talk about it and not just sort of problems out on the phone because it's not nuanced enough? So these young women want to talk about all of these things and they deserve a space to do that. I'm excited that we're getting there. We are on the road. We have started the car. We are driving in the right direction. And I'm seeing a tipping point happening here in BC. There's a lot of young people in particular that are like, hey, I grew up on the internet. So if you could talk to us about some of this stuff, that would be cool. I think that, the way forward is also bringing together, like you were saying earlier, how do we learn from folks that have been in the education system for a long time that are skillful mastery level teachers? And how do we find our space within that to support them? As we learn their mastery, we help them talk about the nuanced conversations that we're a little bit more skillful at because we lived through some of it, and also because we know the kids need it, and we know that it's our responsibility to deliver comprehensive health.
Wow. Jessy, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing having this conversation. I feel like I'm taking so much away from it on a personal level. I hope our listeners are too. And I think one of the main things we at PhD Canada and something we spoke about when we met was having that car movement and having more conversations and being very open around comprehensive health education, comprehensive sexual health education, and what that looks like in schools. And if we can continue to share across the country and resources and in what is working, what isn't working, I think good things will continue to happen. And I think there is so much good going on right now within our sexual health classrooms, great conversations. I think it's something to be celebrated. And yeah, again, just appreciate your time, your insight, your experience is invaluable. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh. And have a wonderful spring break. Teachers will probably hear that's after spring break. So I hope you are rested and ready to go.
We want to hear from you, our community, for season 2. If you have a topic you'd like to hear about, reach out to us on Instagram at PHE Canada. Thanks for joining us on the PHE Canada podcast. Until next time, stay curious and stay active.